Okay, I think I just want to get the annotation. This is Rabbi Chaim Brovender Parsha Shiur of the WebYeshiva. And actually, I'd like to talk a little bit about Tisha B'Av, or more specifically, the Churban Beit HaMikdash. Churban Beit HaMikdash, the destruction of the temple. It's occurred to me that there are other ways to look at it that have not been exploited fully, so I would give it a start. I'll give it a start today. You know that there are two places that we mention whenever we think of the Beit HaMikdash. One is called Mishkan. Mishkan, often translated for some reason as tabernacle. And that was the Mishkan that existed in the desert. You have to remember that when Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Har Sinai the second time and was jump-starting the Jewish people as the people of the Torah, the mitzvah that he chose to be perhaps the defining mitzvah for the nation of Israel was building the Mishkan. And that's why the Mishkan is described at great length in the end of the book of Shemot. The second half of the book of Shemot is primarily about the Mishkan, primarily about the Mishkan. And we often think that somehow the Beit HaMikdash is like an extreme version of the Mishkan. A lot of the things that existed in the Mishkan, of course, existed in the Beit HaMikdash. But there is this essential difference which we have generally not addressed. And that is that the Mishkan was somehow a temporary building, enabling Bnei Yisrael when they were punished with the 40 years in the desert and 42 trips that they took during that time. Bnei Yisrael had to have a Mishkan which had the feature of being taken apart and putting together. You could take it apart, put it together. It was a kind of a Lego. And then after it was actually created, this Mishkan, it wasn't too difficult. It wasn't too difficult to do that. Not at all. Not at all. Not at all really difficult. And the Beit HaMikdash, was certainly a solid structure. I mean, impossible to imagine how they moved the stones. I mean, just look at today at the Kotel Ma'aravi, at the Western Wall, which remains standing of the Beit HaMikdash, the second temple. It's mind-boggling to imagine that they were able to move these stones into place and set them up so that you get a wall not out of bricks or small stones, but of these very big stones. So again, you see that the Mishkan, one of the features of the Mishkan, which we have to take into account, I think, is that it was temporary. And you could take it apart and put it back together again. I mean, anybody could. The people, sure, even though not all of the people were artisans, not all the people were knowledgeable in making the vessels and the sections and the different parts of the Mishkan. It wasn't that difficult to take it apart and put it back together again. That's how it was made. That's how it was made, whereas the Beit HaMikdash, which was built mostly by Shlomo HaMelech, Shlomo the son of David HaMelech, this will come up later in our discussion, it was started maybe by David HaMelech, but the actual built by and this idea of permanence, of these tremendous stones and buildings, parts of buildings that could never be undone. Or at least that's what it may have seemed when they built it. They built it so that nobody would imagine taking it apart again. And so we see these two structures so radically different from each other. The Mishkan, well, I mean, you could take it apart. And when I say you, I mean anybody could. But we also see that in history, even though Bnei Yisrael in the desert, especially when they approached the end of the 40-year sojourn in that desert, they met up with a series of enemies. They were forced into battle. First, at the beginning, by Amalek, but Ammon and Moab, Sichon and Og. They represented the forces that were trying to take down the Mishkan, but we don't hear of that. We don't hear that the Mishkan was actually attacked. The Mishkan was not actually attacked by these conflagrations that took place. Whereas the Beit HaMikdash was attacked by Rishon, by the Bavlim, and by Sheni, by the Romans. And in each case, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. It was taken apart. It was dismembered in such a way that it could not simply be put together, but had to be like an extreme effort to put it together. So these are the things that we remember when we think about the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash. But there are several other things that we might take the time and trouble to try to understand. And they are represented in the Mishnah in Masechet Tzorachim, Perek Yud, the 14th chapter, starting from Mishnah Dalet. So you have, you see Mishnah Dalet, Ad shelo hutam Mishkan. Before there was a Mishkan in the desert, right? I mean, there's the history of Am Yisrael, starting from Abraham Avinu until Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Har Sinai the second time and told people that they had to make a Mishkan. So the halacha says, Ad shelo hukam Mishkan, the Mishnah. Before the Mishkan, before there was a Mishkan, Hayu habamot mutarot. There's an interesting halacha. Bamot are high places where people would sacrifice. So it would seem that according to the Rambam, regularly sacrifices were given before there was a Mishkan. And they were given on these bamot. Bamot are elevated places on which you could build a mizbeach and give a sacrifice. And then he says, Avodah b'bechorot. Well, this is not something that we're interested in the moment, but we understand that there was a class of people who were in charge of the sacrifices that were given, and they were the bechorot. The firstborn son of every family was a Kohen. And they were all over, wherever the Bnei Yisrael were, in Egypt, in Goshen, outside where they made new neighborhoods. Avodah b'bechorot. Meishu kama Mishkan. From the time that the Mishkan was built, ne'esru habamot. So it sounds like bamot are, as the Rambam says, the sacrifices have something unreasonable about that. I mean, that's what everybody did. Everybody gave sacrifices. Everybody worshipped in that way. So you would think that we would try to be a little bit unique in this area. So the Rambam says, Mishahu Kama Mishkan, from the time that the Mishkan was built, as Shru Habamot. People were not allowed to build these bamot in their backyards and give sacrifices, or have little sacrifice centers all over. Va'avodah b'kohanim, and this avodah in the Mishkan was done by the Kohanim, which at that time had already replaced. They had replaced the Bechorot. It was first the Bechorot, that bit is Kohanim, and then the Kohanim from the family of Aaron HaKohen, they acted as Kohanim. Kodshei Kodashim Nechalim Lifnim Min HaKlaim. So the sacrifices that are categorized as Kodesh Kodashim, like the Tamid that was given every day, twice a day, Nechalim Lifnim Min HaKlaim, you eat them inside of the curtains. Klaim is the way they built the Mishkan. The Mishkan was built with curtains instead of real walls. That's why it could be put back together again. Kodashim Kalim, there are Kodashim Kalim called Kodashim Kalim, less limited. The jurisdiction is more obvious. Kodashim Kalim, like let's say the Korban Pesach. B'kol Machanei Yisrael, wherever Bnei Yisrael lived, where they made their camp, you could do it any place. And that didn't have to be specifically in Lifnim Min HaKlaim. So we've seen two things. Well, actually, we've seen one thing, that Bnei Yisrael sacrificed before the building of the Mishkan, wherever, on the Bama. Everybody could build a Bama and give a sacrifice. After the Mishkan was built, they couldn't do that anymore. And that's what existed in the desert from the time that Moshe Rabbeinu told Bnei Yisrael that they had to build a Mishkan. Right? So not only did they build a Mishkan, but they changed the way that they did Avodah, that they served God. And this also seems to indicate that according to the Rambam, sacrifices were a natural and necessary response to the desire that people had to turn to God. How do you turn to God? Sacrifice. That seems to be the case. Now we're up to Mishnah 8. Gilgal. Gilgal is the name of a place that's near where Yericho is today. So that means that the people of Israel, under the leadership of Yoshua ben Nun, right? We've skipped all the way to the end of the Chumash until and along came Yoshua ben Nun, and he took them across the Jordan River. And they came to this place called Gilgal. And so they came to Gilgal with the Mishkan. After all, that's what the Mishkan was. It was portable. So they took it apart, and led by Yoshua ben Nun, they went to Gilgal. Ba'ole Gilgal. V'hutru habamot. And in Gilgal, they were allowed once again to hutru habamot. Why are they hutru habamot? I mean, I don't know exactly, but it would seem that there was a certain difficulty. I mean, they were turned into a fighting force, and people were not away from home, and the fighting force was only from the age 20 to the age 60. Maybe they the people needed more opportunities to feel the closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so who drew a bamot, and they were allowed to build bamot. They were allowed to build bamot. Kodashei Kodashim, so then the korbanot nechalim lifnim miraklayim, Kodashim kalim b'chol makom. So again, this distinction existed between the Kodashei Kodashim, the tummy that was given twice a day, that could only be given in the Mishkan. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the Mishkan, right? Lifnim min aklaim. The klaim are curtains. They were still talking about that when they came into Eretz Yisrael. Now, Kibush Haaretz B'nai Yisrael took 14 years. 14 years. So those 14 years, apparently, the Mishkan existed and was operated in Gilgal. We don't know who the Kohanim were or the Bechorot were. We don't know who they were. But we know that who drew Bamot, we know that people were allowed to bring sacrifices in the outside of the Mishkan when the Mishkan was in Gilgal. After that, Ba'u l'Shilo, it doesn't say exactly why Ba'u l'Shilo. But we who live in Eretz Yisrael know more or less where Shiloh is. There's like a Beit Knesset there that they discovered. Shiloh, north of Beit El, north of Yerushalayim. Ba'u l'Shilo for some reason. For some reason, we'll see in a minute what the reason is, but that somehow Shiloh makes us feel that we're on the way to a more permanent kind of resolution. When they came to Shiloh, Nesra Bamot, so we're back to the same situation that we were in the Mishkan, right before we went to Gilgal, Nesra Bamot. After in Gilgal, Utru Habamot, Ba'u l'Shilo, Nesru Habamot. So since Nesru Habamot is going to be the end of the story, it's going to be the real Mishkan. So Shiloh was closer to the Mishkan because Nesru Habamot. Lo haya sham tikra. And then the Mishnah makes this interesting comment, Lo haya sham tikra. It could be that in Gilgal they did have a tikra, but Lo haya sham tikra, there was no ceiling. Ela bayit shel avanim milmatam. They didn't have a roof in this building in Shiloh, but bayit shel avanim milmatam. But it was built somehow that the bottom, the floor, was made of stone. V'yiriot milimalan, and there were these curtains above to protect the place from the rain or weather, bad weather. V'hi hayta menucha. Hayta menucha. My Hebrew is not good enough to know what hi hayta menucha means, but we can take a guess at it. Menucha is a good thing, rest. It was kind of seen as being the great achievement after Gilgal and after the Midbar. First the Midbar, right, 40 years, 38 years of punishment. Then Gilgal, 14 years in Gilgal. And then they came to Shiloh, and they stayed in Shiloh 369 years. So hi hayta menucha. It was kind of, they felt that this could go on forever. And what do we say about Shiloh? There was a stone floor. Stone. Avanim milimala. V'riyot milimala. Sorry. Again, Mishnah Vav. Baal the Shiloh, Ne'esru habamot, again, Ne'esru habamot, Lo yasham tikra, ela bayit shel avanim milamata, didn't have a roof, but the floor was made of stones, v'yiriot milamala, and there were curtains above, like people make today, where you have a tent of one kind or another, v'yaita menucha. V'yaita menucha, maybe that's about the 369 years that the Mishkan was in Shiloh. And sometimes we call it Mishkan Shiloh, Kodeshei Kodeshim, those sacrifices that are called Kodeshei Kodeshim, as I say. Tomid shel Shachar, Tomid shel Bein Harabayim, Nechalim Lifnim Min HaKlaim, within the curtains, Kodeshim Kalim, Korban Pesach, for example, Umaser Sheni, Bechol Haro, as long as you could see Shiloh territory from outside of Shiloh, as long as you could see it, that was it. Then, without telling me why exactly, but Baal Lenov or the Givon, after Shiloh, after the three, the things happened. We don't have to get into that. If you're interested, just look at the end of the chapters of Shmuel Aleph. We'll tell you, but they left Shiloh. Shiloh was destroyed. And Baal Lenov, another place, or the Givon, after Shiloh, remember Shiloh 369 days? Ne'esru habamot in Shiloh. They went to Nov and Givon, were just stopovers on the way to Yerushalayim. Hutru habamot again. Hutru habamot. Why hutru habamot? It's hard to know. Hutru habamot. Kodeshim nechalim lifnim min haklaim. Kodeshim kalim b'chol arei Yisrael. When they came to Nov and Givon, I mean, nobody's going to go to Nov and Givon. If they have a problem, they have to bring a korban. Who drew habamot? So even Kodeshim Kalim, like the korban Pesach, as I keep saying, B'chol arei Yisrael, wherever people happen to live, Finally, Mishnah Chet, Ba'u liYerushalayim ne'esru habamot. They came to Yerushalayim. The Aron came to Yerushalayim, and that became the Beit HaMikdash, where the Aron was. Ne'esru habamot, v'lo haya lehem od heter. And never again would there be a leniency on this matter. But Ne'esru habamot, the high places we could give a korban were forbidden. No competition. You remember Eliyahu Navi? You remember that story about Eliyahu Navi in the Carmel by Haifa? Right? They gave the korbanot, and the Gemara is very concerned about how did Eliyahu Navi contradict this principle, which said that the mamot are not allowed at all. And the Gemara came to the conclusion that it's a horat sha'ah, that nevuah can somehow direct me to do something that I know is forbidden, as long as it's only for the specific time, and not to contradict the ruling of the Torah. So Pashuna Zayin says, Barun Lenova L'Givon, Utar HaBamot, Kodesh, etc. But Mishnah Chet, Ba'u liYerushalayim, when the Aron was finally brought to Yerushalayim, Ne'esru habamot, v'lo haya lehem od heter. Never again would the Jewish people be allowed to sacrifice habamot. V'yaita nachala, meaning again, it was permanent. It was forever. It could have been. I mean, it wasn't. But it became the nachala, as we said about Shiloh. Kodeshim nechalim lifnim min haklaim, קודשים קהלים ומעשר שני לפנים מן החומה. So we see two interesting ideas. One has to do with the service. As far as we know, avodah was something that the Jewish people were interested in. They wanted to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the good things that happened. And they wanted to ask for those things that had not yet been part of their inheritance. And so they built Bamot. And if you read these Mishnayot, it would seem that there is this theme from Bamot to not Bamot, from Bamot to a permanent situation without Bamot. And the permanent situation existed for a long time in Shiloh, and then for a long time in Yerushalayim. In fact, twice in Yerushalayim, Bayit Rishon and Bayit Sheni. The second thing that we learn is that the notion of permanence doesn't always equal the idea of Bamot. The permanence belongs to Shiloh and Yerushalayim. There was an idea that the permanent places that the avodah would take place in canceled out the Bamot. But when the permanent places, when the permanents disagreed, it was the issue is the first of these places where the Mishnah says, in Mishnah Hey, take a look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Ba'u leGilgal utru habamot. In other words, the needs changed. In the desert, they would camp around the Mishkan. And the Mishkan was accessible to everybody. And therefore, saying that you can't have Bamot made sense because you were moving from place to place. But when they came to Gilgal, that was the camp that they had, the military center for the conquest of Eretz Yisrael. So the things become a little bit disrupted for the people who want to give the sacrifices and who drew Habamot. Shiloh was after the conquest of Eretz Yisrael, more or less. Right? The conquest was never completed, but it was largely completed. Ba'u Shiloh, Ne'ezru Abanot, so there was an attempt again to make a center. And that goes around Bamot, and finally in Yerushalayim, Ne'ezru Abamot, but not in the manner that they were forbidden previously in Shiloh, because after Shiloh, they threw it Abamot. Right, Baal and Noble the Givon, who drew Abamot, was without the center, without the serious center. People went back to Bamot, and they tried to build these Bamot. There's another theme that goes through, and that is the theme of permanence versus the Lego kind of Mishkan. The Mishkan in the desert, as we said, was a place of tefillah that everybody had access to. When they came to Gilgal, we don't know much about the building, but we know when they came to Shiloh, there was an attempt at permanence. Was the temporary nature of the Mishkan became more permanent. And they made a stone floor. And that stone floor was something that was important. Right? Bayit shel avanim milamatan. The bottom, the floor of the Beit Mikdash of Shiloh, the Mikdash of Shiloh was made of stones. So you have temporary becoming more permanent, even though it didn't have a roof, but they put a sheet on the roof, which enabled people to do the avoda even during the winter. Finally, Bo Yerushalayim, we know that Yerushalayim was a building made up of stone, permanent. And so we said at the beginning, that's interesting. At least it seemed to me to be interesting that the temporary building was never destroyed, neither the building in the desert, the Mishkan that we call the Mishkan, or the building in Gilgal. But the permanent building, the building made of stone, of remarkable enterprise, which we call the Beit HaMikdash, that building was destroyed several times, in spite of the fact that it's made of stone. So it's hard to know which is the permanent and which is the temporary. The Mishkan was built in a Lego fashion. You could take it apart if you had to move from one place to another and put it together again. For the people in the desert, that was the permanent Mishkan. That was permanent. That's how they lived. That was what they did. Finally, Bnei Yisrael wanted to build a building that would not be penetrated by the enemies, that could not be destroyed easily, that would stand up to the Iranian rockets. That's what they wanted to build. And when you look at things, you see it's not so obvious which is the permanent and which is the temporary. It turns out that the building that could be taken apart and put back together was the permanent one. That was the permanent building. I remember in Japan, they were afraid of various natural disasters, earthquakes, and so they built houses out of paper. Why did they build a house out of paper? Because you could, if the natural disaster overwhelmed them and the house collapsed, they could just pick it up again with a little crazy glue. So what's permanent? What would you say is permanent? So it seemed to me that, considering the fact that the Torah deals with the Mishkan at great length and tells us about the kelim, the vessels that were used therein, and the actual size of things, it seemed that that's pretty permanent. Whereas the Mikdash that was ultimately built in Shiloh, 369 years and over 400 years from the Beit HaMikdash, they were destroyed. Not taken over, destroyed. Destroyed meaning they'd have to be rebuilt. They'd have to get new stones and new water to hold the stones in place. So we're on the eve of Tisha B'Av. The eve meaning conceptually on the eve of Tisha B'Av. Maybe it was true that the Beit HaMikdash was built of stone because it could be destroyed. And the mikdash was built in a way, I'd always say, of Lego, because that kind of building can never be destroyed. And so when Chazal say that the Beit HaKnesset, the place where Jews come together in an attempt to speak their minds to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is a mikdash ma'at. What do you mean a mikdash ma'at? A little bit of Beit HaMikdash is in that? Well, I don't know about that. Mikdash ma'at. Maybe mikdash ma'at could also be mishkan ma'at. The Beit Knesset. I mean, you could burn it down, but you can't destroy it. The 10 people who are having a minyan, I mean, they could do that any place. There's something that is not destructible about the Mishkan and about the Beit Knesset that's Mishkan Ma'at in the way that the Beit HaMikdash can't be destroyed. Wish you all a happy time. Well over the fast. And don't be afraid to think about what it all means. That makes it more reasonable. All the best. You have a good Shabbos.